Welcome to J Life with Daniel. I'm your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today we are here with Professor Alan Rifkin, who is a former journalist, now novelist, teaches at Cal State Long Beach, and is a father. So, Alan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Daniel.
I'm glad that you told me to throw in the also the father aspect. I think it humanizes a lot of the stories that hopefully we'll get to. One of the reasons why I wanted to have you on is because, like most Jews, I've been seeing the proliferation of anti-Semitism coming out of areas that you don't normally associate with anti-Semitism. And one of those areas has been the world of wider literature. There's been a lot of prominent, say, cancellations of book talks by authors that it's discovered that in their past they might have traveled to Israel. And so even if the book has nothing to do with Israel, the talk is canceled, or one of the people on the panel happened to be associated with a synagogue that is quote unquote Zionist, as the vast majority of synagogues are. And so that event is canceled. I'm curious from the insider perspective, does that jive with what you've been seeing? And what can you tell us, just to start the foundation about anti-Semitism in the literature world?
I don't know how inside I am. I mean, I'm not, somebody who goes to all the conferences, and I'm not, on Oprah. But
Not yet. This podcast has been known to be a springboard to Oprah.
exactly. But it's something I'm obviously really concerned about, and so I've been watching for quite a while. And depending on where we start the game clock, you know, I could talk for a long time just about troubling signs in the literary world. Um, but most recently, it's taken on kind of horror movie dimensions. Everything from students being sent to poetry and literary readings that are entirely focused on anti-Zionism, and as you mentioned, it seems like almost a weekly kind of incident now that somebody is bumped from a panel for having appeared on a Zionist forum, or appeared at Hadassah, when her book doesn't even have anything to do with Zionism. And most recently, Bernard Henri Levy, um, having an ad for his newest book, refused by, a trade publication that goes out to booksellers because Israel is in the title, and their readership of booksellers and possibly customers too might be upset. All the way to, I first started noticing things. I've been teaching creative writing since 2007, and I often use anthologies of classic short stories, all of which at the beginning of my teaching career featured the the Jewish heavyweights of the mid 20th century. I mean, that was a time when American literature was kind of defined by the Jewish writers and the Southern writers.
Just for listeners who aren't familiar, can you give the short list there?
For the Jewish heavyweights, it would have been Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud and Norman Mailer and J.D. Salinger and Grace Paley, and maybe on a slightly more quirky tier would be Stanley Elkin and Bruce J. Friedman, but there were in the anthologies the expected classics from that sector. Uh, Over time, with each successive new edition of these anthologies, and an exception has been the Norton anthology, because Richard Bausch edits that, and it's a marvelous anthology. But the ones more commonly used, all of these authors have been disappeared. You might get a story from Grace Paley, but it has nothing to do with assimilation or the Jewish experience in any way. You might get, I think one of the newest editions of Beverly Lamb's 40 Short Stories has, something by Lauren Groff, who's a contemporary Jewish writer, but doesn't have anything to do with Jewishness or Zionism or anything like that. And so, you know, I would take a calming breath and ask myself, okay, well, there must be some explanation for this other than some insidious purge of Jewish writers. Maybe it's dead white men, you know. But no, there's still Faulkner, there's still Hemingway, there's still John Cheever, there's still all the other from the mid 20th century. There's still James Baldwin and Richard Wright, not to mention all the successors of African American writers, Alice Walker and Toni Morrison and Jamaica Kincaid and everyone else. Every minority now is represented in these anthologies except the Jews. And it troubled me, even before, the protests on campus reached such insane dimensions. And, even before everybody's loyalty oath to, the Palestinian cause became central in every discipline, I was already noticing, just a kind of disappearance and erasure. And at the same time, and I'm also intimately, involved as a kind of, I'm flattering myself by saying mid-list, I'm barely on a list writer, uh, with searching out publishers and literary journals when I have things, stories and books to try to market. And as you go through the listings nowadays, increasingly these journals would have wish lists and submission guidelines that say things like no racism, sexism, homophobia, or Zionism. Or increasingly they would, at the top of the list, of publications that are having, maybe contests or have a deadline for submission periods would be um, themed issues having to do with Palestinian voices, and we seek to elevate Palestinian voices, and now none of that. I'm not a cancel culture prude. I don't like to silence anything or anyone, but the fact that that's the demographic and the ideology that not only is being sought, but sought at the expense of any other point of view, has been going on for, it seems to me, for the better part of the last decade.
Yeah, the New York Times and in the end of May, I just sort of flagged this to bring this up. Had a op-ed, May 27th for people that want to look this up, and the title was "A Chill Has Fallen Over Jews in Publishing," and it sort of goes over exactly what you're talking about. As you sort of noted, I mean, one of the theories here, and I'm kind of interested in throwing out a lot of theories. You can tell me which one jives with your experience more. The literature world, just to give listeners a little bit of background, in what the 60s, 70s took this turn towards postmodernism, post-structuralism, where the idea of grand narratives was, endlessly questioned and everything has to be problematized. And Jews just somehow always ended up on the wrong end of the post-structuralist, postmodernist thought, to the extent where, I mean, we obviously saw in the Soviet Union, not that it's exactly the same, but when you go, far enough left, quote unquote, it just ends up being anti-Semitic, really at its core in some systemic way. And so one
Yeah.
theory is that academia and literature, as was sort of at the forefront of this movement, is just now intertwined with this ideology that's just fundamentally anti-Semitic at its root. Similarly to I don't know, you imagine the Catholic Church had about 1,000 or 1,500 years of anti-Semitism. So you can imagine, nobody would think it's crazy for modern day Catholic institutions to still have a little bit of vestiges of anti-Semitism there. One way of viewing the English world can be that. Another that I actually just wanted to bring up, I was talking to a English professor at UC Irvine. She actually didn't want me to use her name ever associated with this theory, but I was out to lunch with her a couple months ago. It was last year. And I asked her because the English department at UCI, again, one of the more notorious departments at the university in terms of anti-Zionism / anti-Semitism. And I was like, why English? Why, it just seems so random. And her theory was that in the last generation, when all of the current professors were training, the English world and English academia was at the sort of forefront of society and the vanguard of society. And people really looked to writers in the 60s and 70s to really teach them about the world, to delineate right from wrong, to really be that sort of mouthpiece to the people that didn't really have a voice. And that now, because there's such a proliferation of information and also the weakening of academic institutions and the fact that, at any given day, probably 70% of the country doesn't care what English departments say, that English professors have actually captivated on, and the same thing goes for other humanities and social science professors, have really captivated on, okay, if we don't really have this, wider societal influence anymore, we're just going to go really extreme and get a group of people that really care and just try to be as loud as possible. And it's sort of, going out with a bang instead of going out with a whimper. That was her theory from an insider. I'm curious if any of those jive with you, if you have other theories. I mean, this has to be something, right? This can't just be a bunch of people sitting in a room saying, how do we get Jews off of lists for publishing? I mean, there has to be at least one other factor there. So I wanted to throw that out to you.
Oh my gosh, there is so much to unravel. And again, I'm not an authority. Now, one of my blessings is that at our university, or mine, Cal State Long Beach, um, there is, I just think culturally and demographically, um, there's a student population that's just really unusually grounded and level-headed about things and kind of awakening to ideas and literature as first generation, often college students. Grateful to be there, often, uh, mature for their years, with family responsibilities and job responsibilities and so on. And so I don't encounter like a lot of issues in the classroom, or if any, I mean, I can assign anybody in the classroom, and my students are just fascinated to have been introduced to it.
No, I feel the same way.
So,
Sorry to cut you off. I feel the
yeah.
same way with undergrads. I mean, it's really the grad students and faculty that I've
Right.
run into. I mean, both at Cal State Fullerton and at UC Irvine, just the two universities I've been teaching at for at least the last year and this year
Mhm.
also. Those are the people that are more likely to sort of come in top down and try to eradicate some voices and try to be hostile to anybody with an opposing view. The undergrads, 95% of the time, if you're taking a class on, literature or what I teach, Jewish history or literature or anything like that, you want to be challenged. You want interesting ideas. I mean, how boring would it be if you got into a class and everybody agreed with everything and the professor was giving one view? And so I don't know, from my experience, it's a lot more of a top-down problem in the universities. And I would also imagine at these literature, I imagine the average person that was going to go to one of these book talks, they also would welcome the diversity of opinion, but it's because, again, you get this really small number of people that are probably calling up the library or bookstore or coffee shop or whoever's going to host the event, and it's just not worth it for the bad publicity. I mean, the 5% of people that are, the pro-Hamas supporters, they really can ruin people's lives. I mean, if they want, right? All you need is for them to just continuously give bad reviews on your latest book or bad reviews on my coffee shop from hosting an event. And so I don't know. I just,
Yeah. Although, I think, not to drive us into a ditch, but I think the 5% who are loud, unfortunately, are the tip of an, practically 50% iceberg from that age cohort. who are, just sort of quietly assume that the Palestinian narrative is the only just one. And so there's that. I resonate, with some of the other themes that your colleague brought up. The postmodernism, I ran smack into it, of course, in graduate school, getting my MFA, and was so green that, it was a surprise to me that all of this theory was part of the world of English literature instead of the philosophy department, because I wanted to get to my creative writing, which was my love. I wound up giving myself to just the adventure of learning a new, field, learning a new discipline, with Derrida and Foucault and all of them. But yeah, I was kind of surprised at first that that belonged in English literature at all. But since it is there, I think that this is probably just my theory, but you know, I I resonate with some of the things that Barry Weiss talks about. With I think I'm kind of an exceptionalist about America and about a golden age when Jewish values kind of were part and parcel of American values. And I think that that's why kind of the melting pot literature of the mid 20th century was so exciting to me and to most Americans at that time. Um, now melting pot is a dirty word. And granted, our reading lists a generation ago were not as diverse as they should have been. But something has been lost in the process, and that is a sort of idealism and dream at the heart of immigrant groups coming to America, where the Jewish American literature back when, and I think all great American literature is ethnic immigrant literature because it's on the cutting edge of assimilation and of issues of identity and belonging and the pursuit of happiness against a certain degree of odds and generational trauma and baggage and all that stuff. I mean, Junot Diaz's novel, The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, is still, I think, a great American novel because, it's about people kind of trying to escape curses of the past and embrace something new, right? And now, and this isn't a political gripe in any way, but I'm just a little bit, as an older teacher, writer, professor, a little bit sad to see so few books risk that kind of hope any longer. Most books from, immigrant groups or marginalized groups that I read today seem to focus either on being microaggressed in the Ivy Leagues or the struggles of ancestors more than a generation ago.
Mm. This is the other theory, just that I was gonna talk about it in terms of the literary world. You reminded me of one that I forgot to say. This is a little bit more controversial, so listeners can brace themselves. Jews obviously went through hell in the 20th century, and if anybody was a minority that was continuously attacked, that was dealing with systemic violence against them, on the global stage, throughout Europe, throughout the Arab world. I mean, even in America, if you look at what was happening in the 1920s and 30s here with, Henry Ford and, anti-immigration and, which was always anti-Semitic isolationism happening in America. And so if any group was able to claim victim status, right, globally, it could have been the Jews, right? You could have had, millions of Jewish refugees after World War II. immigrate to some other country and for the next 100 years basically continue to claim victim status and continue to say, this happened to us. We're going to keep on reliving, this thing that happened to us in the past. But instead, obviously, the Jewish narrative in the 20th century went from probably one of the worst. I mean, the worst ethnic group to be in the 20th century was a Jew in the 30s, right, or 40s, somewhere in Europe, and then somewhere in the Arab world in the 50s and 60s. I think that's probably beyond controversy. And then when you get to the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, the best ethnic group to be arguably in the world was a Jew, either in Israel or America, right? Both booming economies, both, beacons of liberalism and everything. And from some perspective, right, if you're a minority group that's been inculcated on this, you have no autonomy. Your life struggle and the reason why your ethnic group or the reason why your religious group is not doing as well as others is always reducible to historic circumstances that are beyond your control, right? Don't even try. It's all this other person's fault. The Jews are very inconvenient because, again, it's not obviously a one-to-one ratio, but the ability of Jews to go from victim to success, I think, is just so anathema to some of the ideologies that now is being inculcated in the university and DEI programs and all of this, that I think anti-Semitism might be the only rational conclusion in some sense. It's like the Jews had to have done something wrong, because you shouldn't be able to go from being in a Holocaust to basically inventing American liberalism, which, if you read Jewish writers in the 30s, 40s, 50s, exactly what you're talking about, and inventing a state of Israel in the Middle East. So I don't know. I wanted to throw that out there as well, because that also, I think, jives in a lot of conversations that I've had with people that are on the left. They won't say that outright, but at the root of a lot of what they're talking about, there is a little bit of a animosity / jealousy / confusion about the Jewish situation, how exactly they did it, right? It had to have been unfair. There had to have been Jews, sort of pulling the strings, right? If you go into the more nefarious groups, this was obviously, Mahmoud Abbas's, the head of the PA's dissertation for his PhD, maybe the Zionists actually caused the Holocaust to be able to orchestrate this whole thing to happen. But you get into these anti-Semitic rabbit holes out there. But even at face value, I just think it's too much for a lot of people, because, the Jewish community kind of is showing a mirror saying, you actually can take some responsibility for where you are at, right? Socioeconomically, politically, nationally, everything there. And I'm curious if that jives with, how you're thinking about this, because you kind of started the theory. I just stated it much stronger than you seem to be going.
Well, I think there's some truth in the fact that we've benefited from skin privilege, many of us, not all Jews. There's, also a great misconception that Jews are white, right? And so, one's tendency to succeed as a group rarely wins friends. uh, I always felt a little bit of a clueless outsider to, the alleged, Jewish insiderness, where can I get some of that,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, like, for example, I know that in my career, I benefited from a certain cultural consensus that existed at the magazines that I was writing for and
But
newspapers.
only because, but if you were around 10 or 15 years earlier, it would have been the opposite, right? Like that had to have been a hard fought battle. If you were in the 1940s or 50s in America, the literary journals were not, quote unquote, having, disproportionate number of Jews on
I
editorial
think they
staff.
were. I think they were. At least that in that era. Maybe a decade or two earlier than that, it was troublesome. But maybe I'm misreading. But the publishing world that I've seen romanticized from the 1940s and 50s was filled with New York Jews. You know, and
Got it. So maybe it's the generation earlier. I mean, right
and
from
plus Jews were always, in the vanguard of radical political progressive movements, which were also closely associated with publishing. It's only when that progressivism has to choose between Jews and Palestinians that suddenly we're thrown under the bus because, we've succeeded some, and it's easy to typecast us as being white-skinned oppressors. But I think that I guess what I've seen is that my parents and my grandparents, and it does sound like boasting, I'm sorry, but were just not interested in the victim narrative.
No,
They
I
were
think
they
that's
were
exactly
they
it.
were they were on fire to be Americans, and they succeeded at it pretty well. I mean, my dad, grew up in a one-room apartment where, his parents slept in the living room, and it was a one-bedroom apartment, but he had the bedroom and his parents slept in the living room, and his father was a tailor and his mom was a telephone operator who, lied about her age at in her teens in order to get the job. And they put him, or the Navy did, but they, put him through medical school, you know. And so I was a child of the golden age of Jews in the San Fernando Valley in the 1960s, where I wasn't even aware of my Jewishness. Honestly, I was bar mitzvahed, but the most uh, the royalty at my high school was all Jewish. This was Birmingham High School in Van Nuys at the time, and so it was a time when I think that, yeah, what you're saying was the old traumas were something to be discarded, and all the hope lay um, in blending into this one place that, despite the boats of refugees who were turned away, seemed to give us a pretty fair fighting chance. There were quotas. My dad had to overcome quotas to get into medical school. There were, housing covenants that they had to, but on the grand scheme of things, compared to what was happening in Europe, this was our promised land. And so I'm very sentimental, idealistic, and still probably just hopelessly nostalgic about that time when, people will be quick to point out, well, it wasn't such a golden age for Black people, but Jews were fighting for it to be a golden age for Black people, you know? And so that was, I think, kind of the pivot point where it seemed like what we celebrated about American, exceptionalism, meritocracy, melting pot, whatever you want to call it. It seemed like there was a moment when that was going to lift all boats.
And to some extent, it did. I mean, okay, there's two different conversations here. There's a race conversation and an economic conversation.
Mhm.
Obviously, they've been sort of obscured and muddied together, and they should be, right? They're obviously connected in some way. But from both perspectives, I mean, certainly racially, if we're talking between the 1950s and 60s and now, I mean, of course, all boats have been lifted. Maybe somebody could argue, yes, there's still some of our
Right.
systems still have the same type of ingrained sexism and racism, sure. But to not think that there has been, universal liberal progress in America, I think is just to be blinded. And I think purposely a lot of the conversation now, I mean, whether it's rooted in sort of this need for a revolution, there's an interesting sociological theory about Marxism, which of course, just for listeners, you obviously know this, right? Marx, long sought the day of this, revolution when the workers would finally band together and revolt against the ownership class. And it was almost like, a biblical prophecy, right? Things have to get so terrible to some trigger point threshold that everybody revolts. And so historically, a lot of Marxist regimes were against incremental progress, because if you can raise minimum wage from, let's say, $5 an hour to $10 an hour, right? You still have a class system, but now life is actually a little bit better. And if everybody gets an iPhone and if everybody, has, a car or an automobile, right? Probably you're going to be less likely to have the revolution. So actually a lot of Marxist groups were against the type of incremental, lift all boats slowly. They were, no, let's actually drain the tub. Let's have all boats sink, because once it's at the, pit bottom, that's when we'll have the revolution. And so I actually think it's more sinister than that. I think that there are ideologies right now that are trying to convince people that things are terrible. Things have always been terrible in America. Things are actually getting worse now. There's been no progress made. We're still divided, as we were 60, 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago on race, on
Right.
gender, on sexual orientation. And again, Jews have just refused to play that game. I mean, obviously you have some Jews that are, maybe engaging in that a little bit, but the same thing when you reflect on your family story. My grandfather spent his middle school and high school, or what should have been his middle school and high school years, hiding in a farm in Minsk, Russia, to avoid the Nazis. He basically ate bugs and whatever he can find in a forest for years. Came to America on a boat, of course, didn't know English, didn't know anything, past a fifth grade education, taught himself English, bought a tiny one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn, where all the Russian Jewish immigrants were. Worked as a postal service guy for his whole life. Never moved out of that small one-bedroom place. My dad grows up in that one-bedroom place in Brooklyn, and then studies hard, goes to college, goes to grad school, and he's been a professor for 30, 40 years. And again, there was never conversation. I mean, in years of having Shabbat dinners and Passover seders and Rosh Hashanah with my grandfather, never any complaining. I mean, we would try. My brother and I, he passed away when I was in 9th or 10th grade, but I remember in middle school trying to ask him, we called him Zadie, what was it like? He was our age, and he basically said, he's like, yeah, it was troubling, troubling, but there was he wasn't even willing to go there. And again, I don't think it was just to protect us. I think it was just his mentality was, he's here now. What he cares about is, the small synagogue down the street full of all these Russian Jewish immigrants, and my parents, and my aunt's education, and just making sure that was being forward looking. And, again, he could have gone on and on about, all of the, anti-Semitism that he faced as a, Russian Jewish immigrant. My parents moved to San Diego, where they eventually bought a house in, the 70s. It was illegal for Jews to buy property there in the 60s, right? Before UCSD opened, Jews couldn't buy property in a lot of San Diego. Same with actually Orange County, in areas like Newport. And I'm pretty sure also parts of Long Beach as well, but I have to fact check that.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, Long Beach was the epicenter of the movement in the 1960s to overturn fair housing laws in California.
Yeah.
Well, have your parents ever been on your podcast?
No, I probably should. That
I
actually
would
is a good
love
idea.
to hear them.
Yeah, I really should. That would actually be yeah. I mean, my dad is in he's a physics professor, so I think physics has been a little bit less affected by the type of anti-Semitism. Although
Oh, I hope so, but the sciences, I've heard terrible stories coming from the sciences.
yeah, they're getting
Just
there.
about,
I mean,
like just in the way research is funded and so on. And, if we look at the publications, the university organ publications that come out from whatever universities you teach at, and they list grant winners, and they list, people who've won scholarships for this paper or dissertation or article or that, and where the research money is going. It always seems to be checking certain boxes that Jews do not and cannot check.
yeah, one would hope. I mean, there are sort of two different types of academic tracks. I mean, and I say this as a humanities person, so I'm going to seem like we're insulting our field for a second. Maybe I will, but if you have a field based on empiricism is empiricism, whether somebody, a man, woman, somebody of black, white, AI, comes up with the theory. If it allows us to build a bridge, more cost effectively, we're going to build the bridge more cost effectively. It's the more subjective fields, right? Art, literature, history, right? Those fields that seem more attuned to what's going on now because it kind of is. I mean, anytime you talk, I mean, for sure, literature and art, I mean, that is sort of all in the eye of the beholder to some extent. And so if the beholders are now anti-Semites, to some extent, okay, you're going to have to tailor your art and literature towards that. Even history, where, or the social sciences, which are sort of empirical, but also sort of based on the subjective interest of the person studying it. I mean, one of the things I've noticed is, somebody who studies Jewish history is there's obviously been a proliferation of people writing about how Jews fared perfectly in, Islamic countries in the 1800s and 1900s. And then, big bad Zionism came and ruined everything. And again, one of the things that this will do is it'll, narrow in on very specific times and very specific places. So, okay, and, Turkey and the Ottoman Empire in the 1840s, if Jews fared very well, I'm just making up an example, if Jews fared very well in one city and the mayor was Jewish for a time, that's proof that Jews under the Ottoman Empire were doing perfectly. And that's probably true, but it doesn't zoom out. I mean, it's like if somebody were, in 1,000 years from now trying to write a report on the California politics in 2024, and their entire study circulated around how Huntington Beach is super Republican. It's true that Huntington Beach is a Republican district. They're probably going to vote for Trump at a 75-25 rate, but that's obviously missing the much bigger picture of California. So it seems like for now, at least the sciences are protected. There's also one of the other interesting differences that I've noticed between the sciences and non-sciences is there's a lot more cross collaboration with other people that you wouldn't naturally assume collaboration with. And so scientists are all the time collaborating with, Chinese or Russian or even Iranian scientists, from across countries. And that just doesn't seem to happen I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember seeing, a social science or political science book ever co-authored by, somebody living in China who's not against the Chinese government, just somebody who happens to be at some university in China and somebody in America. Maybe it's happened once or twice, but, consistently physics papers are banged out. You have a guy from India, a guy from China, a guy from America, and they're not all in America, right? They're at all these different universities and they're collaborating because there is some
It's a
quote
splendid
unquote,
thing.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they may even like cooperate on like space travel and stuff like that. Yeah.
Um,
That's
so where
fascinating.
so where do you think we go from here? I mean, you sort of are highlighting the idealism of, what we would call the golden age for American Jewry, sometime, I don't know, we'll call it post World War II to maybe exactly a year ago. Do you do you agree with sort of the doomsdayists that the golden age of Judaism in America is over? Are you optimistic? Where do you sort of sit on that debate?
I, I'm so bad at forecasting anything ever. I'm more the type of personality who tends to project the worst. And so it's kind of like probably not the right question to ask me. Um, uh, what I felt in my gut um, on, last October 8th, you know, was that I have to honor the truth that I know. And I no longer have the luxury of trying to, save my own position um, uh, based on what I see happening to, uh, threatening, kind of crystal knock levels of anti-Semitism in the US and in the West. I'm not as worried about Israel, but I'm worried very much about us. And it's so hard for me to get a read on um, whether Americans will go along the way, and I hate to be this hyperbolic, but the way good Germans went along with these same kinds of insidious um, levels of discrimination that, were like boiling a frog in gradually in water, right? Um, the last year suggests that Americans will go along with Jews being hounded on college campuses, not so much ours, but with Jews being hounded on college campuses and on the streets of New York and at sidewalk cafes in West Hollywood. And most Americans will not even bring it up as a campaign question, you know, for um, for Harris and Trump, right? So that doesn't give me a good feeling. Now, at the same time, the counterbalance to that is, I could be in a kind of algorithmic house of mirrors, where I'm only seeing my worst fears on social media. I follow all these accounts where they're showing me the latest outrage at, Columbia or Harvard or, or in, you know, Great Britain, So I honestly don't know what the hell is going on. It's really hard to get a read on it. And we're also living through this crisis in journalism where, you know, nobody trusts media. And I'm not sure I do. I mean, the
Well, the
whole
LA Times, I mean, I just saw this
let's
yesterday,
talk about
right? The
the
LA
LA
Times, I mean,
Times.
I'll just lay it for listeners and you can comment on it, just at least from what I've read. The LA Times refused to endorse a candidate, right? So not Trump, not Harris. They obviously, the editorial board would have endorsed Harris. Um, Everybody initially assumed it was because the owner is a billionaire and, the billionaire maybe wanted Trump in. It was just discovered maybe yesterday that actually the reason is because the billionaire has a daughter who is extremely anti-Israel and she refuses to endorse Harris because Harris is quote unquote promoting the genocide that Joe Biden has allowed, right? So
Insiders say it was not just his daughter, that he shares that view.
that he shares that. Interesting.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, what's going to happen? I mean, we're sitting here, right, just to timestamp this, right, in case people are listening to this after the election. It's October 27th right now. I mean, we're standing here, a week and a half before the election. And one of the things that I'm actually fearing the most when talking about, how how much trouble are Jews actually in, if Kamala Harris loses, to say nothing about, who I want to win or lose, if she loses, that's going to be a huge boon for the pro-Palestinian crowd. I mean, the lesson that I think Democrats are going to learn, maybe, probably erroneously, is if Trump wins, they're going to have a ton of power next election to court Democrats, because they're basically, the narrative is going to be Kamala Harris lost the election because she wasn't anti-Israel enough. I think there is
Although
a flip side.
she's also losing Jewish votes
No, she's of course losing Jewish
for not
votes. And listen,
being,
you know,
yeah.
4 years ago, I couldn't imagine that I would be a little bit equivocal on who I want to win the election, right? I mean, that would have considered, I remember getting the ballot in 2020 and 2022 and, just voting Democrat all the way down, right? I didn't even have to check,
Right.
who was running, I don't care, state senator,
Yeah, I've never
Democrat,
voted for a Republican in my life.
yeah, right. And so I was exactly the same way. And now, okay, I'm not going to vote for Trump, but I know a lot of people that are, right? A lot of Jews who are liberal, a lot
Right.
of college students,
Hmm.
a lot of Jewish college students are going to vote for Trump. I mean, I'm very interested to see that
Really?
that data. I mean, again, this is all anecdotal, and
Hmm.
in Southern California, as both at Long Beach and UCI, I have a lot of family in Los Angeles. Right, we're dealing with a lot of South Africans, we're dealing with a lot of Persian Jews, we're dealing with a lot of Israeli Jews, and so the Ashkenazi old school American Jews are gonna, the non-Orthodox ones are gonna vote liberal still, probably at a very high rate. I don't know a single Persian Jew not voting for Trump, but that was probably true 4 years ago and 8 years ago also. But it is interesting to hear students talk about politics, at Shabbat dinners. I won't obviously say any
Yeah.
names, but I've been very surprised to, hear students who, again, total stereotyping, but just based off, their appearance, I would guess, of course, that person is going to vote, Democrat, have a comment saying, I don't know if I can vote for Harris because of Israel. But either way, I think that's going to be the narrative. And, for the LA Times to sort of feed into this, not that I think anybody looks to the LA Times for who to vote for, in 2024, which is, I think, is connected to what you're talking about, the sort of distrust of media. And it's a problem, and it's a catch-22, because media in the past has been so biased in so many ways. I mean, this is the latest example. If you have a billionaire and his daughter who just, on a political whim refused an endorsement, this is only a symptom of, I think, what's been happening for the last 20, 30 years. I mean, it's probably the same thing with a lot of information of how much doesn't get through because of personal biases and money and things like that. So, okay, we don't trust, our trust in media goes down, but then all these alternative media spaces are going up. And I don't want to go to Joe Rogan for my worldview either. And so people are caught in the system, and everybody's listening to different media, and we end up getting into the situation where nobody has any trust for anyone anymore. And yeah, I mean, I just don't see how a country moves forward with that in any sense. So sorry, I know I cut you off there.
Let me put my finger on some things that give me hope, because you asked me to, and I need to. One thing is Barry Weiss's Free Press, which continues to attract readers with a kind of heterodox approach to journalism that I used to get excited by. I've been talking a lot in the last couple days about how the journalism that excited me in the past, now I subscribe to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal so I can get opposite slants on the same story, you know. But the journalism that excited me in the past would bring those to collide within one story, and it blew my mind. It's part of why I became a journalist, because it was driven by doubt and curiosity and debate, And so I have hope that millions of readers like me are just so sick of the tribal propaganda that comes out of pick your favorite media outlet, where, experts say, your tribal propaganda point insert here, and I'm going to roll my eyes even if I agree with that story, because it's just so boring and I'm just so sick of it, And so I have a gut feeling, and I think it's maybe being borne out by the droves of people leaving, giving up subscriptions to legacy publications, that journalism will always thrive because there's always going to be people who want it. It's just that journalism isn't happening in the places that we used to look to for journalism. So I do have hope about that. Do I have hope about literature? I feel like we're living in kind of a dark age for literature. I don't like what I read. I'm using an anthology. Some of the I'm using one anthology from 2024, the best short stories of 2024, that has some pretty exciting stuff in it. It really depends on who's editing the volume. But in a lot of my classes, I'm using stories from 2017 because, they were less, they seemed more adventurous and less afraid of exploring controversial, nuances on the page. I could talk about that for a long time, but
Interesting. No, I do, one of the things that gives me hope, I guess, is it's turned into hopefully optimistic therapy session. No, I say this half in jest, but I've noticed this about myself and I've noticed this about a lot of other people, that I'm a lot more willing to fully speak my mind in the last year, right? In the past, saying a lot of things, I tried to, I've been living on a college campus between undergrad, grad school, and now, I'm the Hillel rabbi. I also teach, courses at a couple of universities. Basically for 13, 14 years, I've been, living on campus. And so I've always tried to fit in within the, mainstream liberal / progressive, the DEI, and, very careful about exactly, no microaggressions. And, again, I'm, at the end of the day, I just want
we're not cheering for microaggressions.
Exactly. At the end of the day, I just want everyone to feel comfortable. So whatever the norm is in a situation I'll go in, I'll sort of adopt to it. But in the last year, I'm a lot less afraid of getting called the names should I mess up, right? So in the past, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I wouldn't say certain things or ask certain things or even, throw out certain challenging thought experiments in, a class that I'm teaching at Cal State Long Beach, because God forbid somebody misunderstands the question and then writes a review saying, oh my God, I'm, racist or sexist or whatever, for just throwing out a thought experiment, you know, and now because Jews have basically been called everything under the sun. I mean, Zionists have become synonymous with white supremacists and, Nazis and everything like that. Okay, so if somebody hears our discussion and, thinks that my bit about race and Jews was a little bit racially insensitive, and they say, oh my God, I'm a racist, okay, racist is actually less bad than the white supremacist and Nazi you called me last week. So I'm less worried. And I have noticed this with a lot of students also, because everything's been chalked up to 100, because everything, and I see the same thing with Trump also, and again, I say this as somebody not voting for Trump, but I see this, because everybody's throwing out all the stops. I mean, just the other day, the head of the Atlantic, wrote an op-ed. It was titled, Trump is literally Hitler. I think they actually changed the title a couple hours after they got some complaints. But okay, if everything, if Trump is a fascist and a dictator and Hitler, and then he comes in and he governs in a way that I wouldn't like. And, he obviously says some abhorrent things. And, January 6th was terrible, one of the worst days in American history. But then Trump comes in and, I think if he wins, it'll be 4 years of, some far right policies. But, at the end of the day, I think the country will survive. Then in 10 years from now, if
Well, I
somebody
think
calls,
if
yeah.
it does, sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no,
I
please.
think if it does survive, I think it'll be in spite of him. I mean, I do think he's capable of terrible things. I do think he's some kind of pyromaniac. I get the feeling, who is just willing to push as far as he can push. But I don't think Americans will let him. I do worry that Americans won't stand up against um, rabid anti-Semitism throughout the land. I do worry that they won't. I'm kind of betting on Americans that they're getting sick of thought police overall, and uh, you know, just this sort of segregated media world that we live in terms of ideas. I do think that people are sick of that, and I have a gut feeling that that will get better. And as it gets better, it will be better for Jews, right? But I'm unfortunately in a very, very demoralized place about um, whether people will ever care about us the way we hoped they would. We had about a 1 day honeymoon of sympathy after the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. And after that, you know, there are very, very few people who, are fired up to make it their cause, even among Jews.
Yeah, but in
You
some
know,
sense, that's the whole ethos of Zionism. Meaning, I mean, I've been saying this for years, even before October 7th, because I, go and speak at, synagogues all over the country and, speak to parents of high schoolers. And the question that all the synagogues have for me is, what do we do on campus to convince non-Jews to stop being anti-Israel? And I always, depending on how I'm feeling that day, I either facetiously answer them, with the ironic answer, or I just straight up say it. I'm like, a guy named Herzl had the same question in the late 1800s, and he decided you can't. So, okay, we need a state and an army and everything. And so, to some extent, that's still my answer. Meaning,
but
I'm
do we
still
have to? But do we have to go there?
I don't think we have to. Personally, I don't think we have to go there. But I think Israel does give American Jews the cover that we need, because at any point, I mean, a couple different situations. One, obviously, things go to hell in America. Israel would protect American Jews, and American Jews could get to Israel. Obviously, things aren't going to change in 1 second. I don't, this isn't some,
Mhm.
sitcom type thing where, everything goes from 100 to 0 in a minute. Um, but even just the power and the backing to know that Jews can, fight back in America for the next couple of years. And if it doesn't work out, I mean, we all can move to Israel. I mean, it just is that sort of insurance policy for American Jews. I mean, of course, I love Israel for so many other reasons than it being sort of a banal insurance policy, but to a large extent, I guess I've always seen Jews as being alone. And, at times, again, there's strategic alliances that you join into. I don't know. I guess this has sort of always been my view. I also grew up, my whole life of Warnakepa, growing up in a very waspy neighborhood that, weekly walking to synagogue on Shabbat, we'd get people screaming out, effing Jew when I was in elementary school and middle school. And that was just sort of normal. It was like, oh yeah, like there's Jews and we look out for each other. And then there's a bunch of non-Jews who all hate us. And every once in a while, a non-Jew doesn't hate us. And like, okay, great. You can be friends with them, but be a little bit suspicious. And that's kind of still my view. I mean, I think I've evolved in a lot of ways, intellectually and socially. And, I have a lot of non-Jews who are good friends of mine now. But I think sociologically, I think I've always kind of felt like I also grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community, which, might explain some of the sociology of this. But essentially, that was Herzl's view as well. I mean, Herzl's view, just to remind listeners, was a giving up of liberalism. I mean, it was, we've tried liberalism and liberalism doesn't work because liberalism works when everything's perfect. But the second something happens, Dreyfus affairs, financial collapse, some war, everybody blames the Jews. And once the Jews get blamed, liberalism, everybody realizes liberalism is a house of cards and Jews are the first ones to get hurt. And so my position in America is sort of the same, right? Like American liberalism has been great for Jews. I mean, I think, everything you're talking about in terms of Jewish golden age is because of liberalism and the idea of meritocracy and the idea that, America doesn't have a, state-run religion. I mean, all the differences that we can, probably talk about for weeks. And so as American Jews, we have to uphold liberalism to the best that we can, but we also have to understand that liberalism is not guaranteed. I mean, it wasn't guaranteed in, the ancient Roman, ancient Rome. It wasn't guaranteed in Germany. I mean, Germany was one of the most liberal countries in the world in the 1920s and 30s, and it's not guaranteed in America. And so I think we have to be willing to understand that if liberalism doesn't succeed, then, okay, well then, there are other options, in other words, nationalism and, Israel and Zionism and things like that. This is also why, I mean, this will be the last thing I say, and then I'll let you see if you have any closing thoughts, because we've been talking for a while here. A lot of the people that are voting for Trump, I talked to a lot of my, my wife's family and friends. And, again, my wife is Persian. And so it's a big, Persian community. Most of her aunts and uncles / all of them, fled Iran in 79. And when I talk to them about, why they're all voting for Trump, and, I'm very vocal with my opinions of not liking Trump at the, Shabbat table. So there's been a lot of good conversations over the years. They always stop me and they say, you're talking about things, these broad ideas, democracy and liberalism and but the other side's not being liberal. And so their view is, you fight illiberalism with illiberalism. My view, I'd imagine your view is you fight illiberalism by doubling down on liberalism. I still believe in that, but to a point, right? Like I'm not going to die from the ideal of liberalism, right? If it comes to being illiberal or saving myself.
Where would that be put to the test? I mean, and what kind of scenario would that be a choice?
I think it could be a choice if, say, Kamala Harris fully caved to the, anti-Israel protesters, which of course she hasn't. She's, she gets like a B- in my view for, her comments in the last 6 months. But let's say she didn't. Let's say in 4 years from now, we're running this again. We have presidential nominee J.D. Vance, who, has some equally, America First guy as vice president versus somebody that basically has AOC's views about Israel, views Israel as, maybe not the bad guy in the region, but there's Hamas is bad, Hezbollah's bad, and Israel's bad, and they're all bad. And, that type of view, I think in some sense that would come to the test of whether or not, liberalism versus self-preservation. I only bring this up because I think that this is a conversation that a lot of, from some perspective, the Ashkenazi Jews in America that have been here for 4 or 5 generations, liberalism has been our saving grace. When you take the Persian Jewish community, it was
Mhm.
the democratic revolution that screwed them, right? Like things were going well when you had a illiberal Shah
Right.
in there. And then all of a sudden, people start talking about, liberalism and freedom and blah, blah,
Right.
blah. And that very quickly gets co opted by, literal terrorists. And then all of a sudden, hundreds of thousands of Jews have to flee, leaving all their
But also
belongings and start
theocracy.
also, but the theocracy happened after, right? Like this is the same thing that they're seeing, right? The progressives in Iran who were
Mhm.
idealistic and naive basically had this mentality that you see on the far left today, which is okay, everybody needs to fight against this injustice. And then afterwards, we'll figure out exactly what we want to do with all these other tricky questions like minority rights and feminism and LGBTQ
Mhm.
and Jews and, Baha'i and all these people.
Turned out
And
it wasn't
so
so tricky.
yeah, that wasn't so tricky because the theocrats were willing to use basically they were willing to kill opposition, and the people that were out there for the democracy protests in Iran, they didn't come with submachine guns, and so of course Iran 50 years later is what it is today, right? So in a lot of ways, I mean, I only bring this up because this is sort of my other community is the Persian Jewish community. Just their entire view of politics is different. I mean, they're more skeptical of people that are, oh, we have to vote for Harris because of democracy, and what's so good about that's that for them is a red alarm. The same way we say you have to vote for Harris because Trump is a fascist, we're like, oh my god, of course. And so I only bring this up because I think it's a very interesting, different angle to look at the situation. Again, this doesn't mean that it's not enough to convince me to vote for Trump, but I think there is a real question of at the end of the day, all these ideas sound very nice, but if there's nothing backing it, and if liberalism is just going to be able to cave to Jew hating the second people stop paying attention, I don't know. There is room to be a little bit more skeptical. Anyway, I'll give you any final thoughts, any final words.
I think I'm learning so much from what you're saying, but I think possibly more important than who we elect might be, you know, just the scenario for education, and I don't really like where either party seems to be taking us in that regard. Um, but something has to change where uh, where college students and younger are exposed to a contest of ideas. And um, you know, so far, what's happening in it to schools in Florida, I don't think that's the answer, but uh, I think, the hope has to be, and what probably our most ground level fight has to be, is at school boards and, in our own universities to make sure that there's programming and course offerings and speakers, the kinds of things that, that, the anti-Zionist movement has kind of steadily, patiently, monopolized over the last 40 years or so, so that our um, our beloved students, they have just they don't encounter our narrative anywhere. It's not in the LA Times, it's not in the Washington Post. Maybe in their homes you know, um, if they're lucky. But most students just assume that uh, that you know Jews came and stole some land, that didn't belong to them, and isn't that kind of like just basic, MIDI Studies 101, and so if that's the case, and they've also been taught that oppression justifies any kind of behavior whatsoever, and that they're being invited to project any injustice that's ever happened to them on these global causes, um, we're in great danger. I'm optimistic about my own campus. Our president has been wonderful in kind of like setting a wall between academic freedom and the attempts to, you know, cut off like study abroad and stuff like that, But I worry most about the next generation. I mean, my kids only know anything about the Zionist narrative because I've spoken it to them. And sometimes they're surprised by it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, troubling, fascinating, means we have a lot of work to still do. Um, Alan Rifkin, thank you so much for talking.
Thanks. It's been a pleasure, Rabbi.